King Charles just did the unthinkable. The monarch, who's supposed to stay silent in politics, just marched into Parliament with a message so explosive that Keir Starmer couldn't even respond. The Prime Minister stood frozen as centuries of constitutional tradition shattered in front of the entire nation. What happened in that room is sending shockwaves through Westminster, and what comes next could change Britain forever. This isn't just royal drama, this is a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. The doors of the House of Commons burst open at exactly 2:47 p.m. on what everyone thought would be another ordinary Tuesday afternoon. MPS were settling into their seats, shuffling papers, preparing for what they assumed would be routine parliamentary business. But nothing about this moment was routine. King Charles III entered the chamber unannounced, without the ceremonial pomp, without the golden carriage, without any of the theatrical pageantry that usually accompanies a royal visit to Parliament. This was different. This was urgent, and everyone in that room knew immediately that something unprecedented was happening. The king wasn't wearing his crown or his regal robes. He was dressed in a simple dark suit, his face etched with an expression that witnesses would later describe as a mixture of determination and barely contained fury. Behind him, royal protection officers moved swiftly to secure the entrances while stunned MPs sat in absolute silence. The Speaker of the House, Lindsay Hoyle, rose from his chair with visible confusion spreading across his face. In over 300 years of parliamentary history, nothing quite like this had ever occurred. The British monarchy doesn't just show up to Parliament unannounced. They don't interrupt proceedings. They certainly don't confront the Prime Minister in front of the entire legislative body. Keir Starmer was mid-sentence when the King entered. The Prime Minister had been addressing a question about economic policy, his voice confident and measured as he outlined his government's latest initiatives. But the moment he saw King Charles striding down the centre aisle, his words died in his throat. The colour drained from Starmer's face. His hands gripped the dispatch box as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Other ministers on the front bench turned in their seats, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Opposition MPS leaned forward, trying to comprehend what their eyes were showing them. King Charles didn't wait for an invitation to speak. He didn't seek permission from the Speaker. He simply positioned himself in the centre of the chamber, his presence commanding absolute attention from every single person in the room. The silence was deafening. You could hear the breathing of hundreds of MPS, all holding their collective breath, waiting for whatever was about to come next. Security personnel at the entrances stood frozen, uncertain whether they should intervene or stand down. This was the king, after all. But this was also Parliament, the seat of British democracy, a place where even monarchs are supposed to tread carefully. What happened next would dominate every news headline for weeks to come. King Charles looked directly at Keir Starmer, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the chamber with unmistakable authority and barely suppressed anger. He began by referencing documents that had apparently come into his possession, documents that allegedly revealed details about government policies that hadn't been disclosed to the public. The King's words were measured but devastating, each sentence landing like a hammer blow against the government's credibility. He spoke about constitutional responsibilities, about transparency, about the duty of government to serve the people rather than special interests. Starmer remained standing at the dispatch box, his face now flushed red, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The Prime Minister, known for his legal background and his ability to argue and debate with precision, appeared completely unable to formulate a response. His fellow Labour ministers sat rigid in their seats, their eyes darting between the King and their leader, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The opposition benches were equally stunned, though some Conservative MPS couldn't quite hide the hint of satisfaction on their faces at seeing the Prime Minister so thoroughly blindsided. The King continued, his voice rising with intensity as he outlined what he described as a pattern of decisions made without proper consultation, without regard for constitutional norms, without consideration for the long-term consequences to the nation. He spoke about commitments made to foreign powers without parliamentary approval. He mentioned financial arrangements that seemed to benefit a select few, while ordinary British citizens struggled with rising costs and declining services. Every word was chosen with precision, every accusation backed by what the king claimed was documented evidence that he had personally reviewed. MPs on both sides of the chamber began whispering to each other, creating a low murmur that grew steadily louder. Some pulled out their phones, trying to capture what was happening despite parliamentary rules against such devices. Security made no move to stop them. Everyone understood that this moment was historic, that it would be analysed and debated for generations to come. The constitutional implications were staggering. The British monarchy operates on an unwritten understanding that the king or queen stays above politics, that they advise and warn in private but never ever confront the government in public. King Charles was shattering that understanding in the most spectacular fashion possible. He referenced conversations he claimed to have had with the Prime Minister in private, conversations where he had apparently raised concerns that were dismissed or ignored. He spoke about warnings he had issued about the direction of certain policies, warnings that had fallen on deaf ears. And now, standing in the House of Commons itself, he was making those private concerns devastatingly public. The look on his face suggested this wasn't a decision he had made lightly, but rather one forced upon him by circumstances he could no longer tolerate. Starmer finally found his voice, but what came out was halting and uncertain. He began to say something about constitutional propriety, about the separation between Crown and government, but the King cut him off with a sharp gesture. There would be time for the Prime Minister's explanations later, Charles indicated, but right now the Chamber and the nation needed to hear the truth. The King then produced a folder from inside his jacket, holding it up for everyone to see. Inside, he claimed, were copies of documents, communications and reports that told a very different story from the one the government had been presenting to Parliament and to the British people. The Speaker finally intervened, his voice shaking as he tried to restore some semblance of order to the proceedings. But how does one maintain order when the King himself is creating the disorder? Parliamentary procedure has no provision for this scenario. The rule book doesn't cover what to do when the monarch decides to personally confront the government in front of the entire legislature. Lindsay Hoyle looked completely out of his depth, torn between his duty to protect parliamentary procedure and the impossible position of trying to manage a situation involving the head of state. King Charles wasn't finished. He turned to address the chamber as a whole, speaking directly to the MPs, who sat in stunned silence around him. His words took on a different tone now, less confrontational towards Starmer specifically, and more pleading with the entire assembly to recognise what he described as a critical moment for British democracy. He reminded them of their oath to serve the people, to uphold the principles that had made Britain a beacon of democratic governance for centuries. His voice carried the weight of genuine concern, even fear about the direction the country was heading. The King spoke about letters he had received from ordinary citizens, thousands upon thousands of them, expressing desperation about the state of the nation. He talked about veterans who had served their country faithfully and now found themselves unable to afford basic necessities. He mentioned families torn apart by economic policies that seemed designed to benefit the wealthy while crushing everyone else. He referenced communities that had been promised investment and renewal but had seen nothing but decline and abandonment. These weren't abstract political talking points for King Charles. These were real people, real suffering, real consequences of governmental decisions. What made this moment even more extraordinary was the vulnerability the King displayed. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about his constitutional limitations, about how he had spent his entire life preparing to be a monarch who would stay above the political fray, who would advise and counsel but never interfere. But what was he supposed to do, he asked the chamber. When private counsel fell on deaf ears, what was his responsibility when he possessed information that suggested the government was not acting in the best interests of the people? At what point did his duty to the nation override the traditional boundaries of his role? Starmer had regained some composure by this point and attempted to respond. The Prime Minister's voice was tight with controlled anger as he began to speak about constitutional boundaries, about the dangers of the monarchy involving itself in political matters, about the precedent this moment was setting. But his words sounded hollow in the face of the King's passionate appeal. Several Labour MPs looked uncomfortable, their loyalties clearly divided between supporting their party leader and grappling with the substance of what the King was alleging. From the Conservative benches, voices began to emerge. Some MPs called for the King to be allowed to present his evidence in full. Others demanded that the Prime Minister address the specific allegations being made. The chamber descended into chaos as MPs from all parties began shouting questions and demands. The Speaker hammered his gavel repeatedly, trying desperately to restore order, but the situation had spiralled far beyond his control. This wasn't just a breach of protocol anymore, this was a full-blown constitutional crisis playing out in real time. King Charles raised his hand and remarkably the chamber quieted. There was still an inherent respect for the Crown, even in this moment of unprecedented confrontation. The King then made an offer that would dominate political discourse for weeks afterward. He proposed that an independent commission be established immediately, comprised of retired judges, constitutional experts, and representatives from civil society to examine the evidence he had compiled. He wasn't asking Parliament to simply take his word for anything. He was demanding transparency, accountability, a full and public investigation into the matters he had raised. The implications were staggering. If the Prime Minister agreed to such a commission, he would essentially be admitting that there were legitimate questions to be answered about his government's conduct. But if he refused, he would appear to be hiding something. Especially given that the King himself was willing to submit all his evidence to independent scrutiny. Starmer was trapped and everyone in that chamber knew it. The Prime Minister's legal mind was clearly working overtime, trying to find a path through this impossible situation. Behind the scenes, as would later be reported, royal aides and government officials were engaged in frantic communication. Nobody in the King's inner circle had been told about this dramatic intervention in advance. Charles had apparently made the decision entirely on his own, driven by what he viewed as an absolute necessity to act. Government ministers were desperately trying to reach their colleagues, seeking guidance on how to respond. Constitutional experts were being called by news organisations, all trying to make sense of what was happening. The King then did something that shocked even those who thought they could no longer be shocked by this situation. He turned to the opposition benches and specifically addressed them. He made clear that this wasn't about party politics, that his concerns would apply to any government, regardless of which party held power. He reminded the chamber that he had served under governments of different political persuasions throughout his long life as Prince of Wales, and his commitment had always been to the nation itself, not to any particular political ideology. This wasn't an attempt to bring down the Labour government, he insisted. This was an attempt to save British democracy itself. Conservative leader Rishi Sunak rose to his feet, clearly torn between political opportunity and constitutional propos. Conservative leader Rishi Sunak rose to his feet, clearly torn between political opportunity and constitutional propriety. His words were carefully chosen as he expressed respect for the King's concerns while also acknowledging the unprecedented nature of this intervention. Sunak called for calm heads and rational discussion, but his political instincts were clearly seeing an opening to exploit. Other Conservative MPs were less restrained, openly calling for Starmer's resignation, demanding immediate answers to the King's allegations. The Liberal Democrats and other smaller parties added their voices to the chaos. Some supported the King's call for an independent investigation. Others expressed deep concern about the constitutional implications of a monarch directly challenging a democratically elected government. The SNP used the moment to renew calls for Scottish independence, arguing that this crisis demonstrated the fundamental dysfunction of the Westminster system. The chamber had devolved into complete pandemonium, with MPs shouting over each other, accusations flying in every direction. Through it all, King Charles remained standing in the centre of the chamber, his face betraying a mixture of determination and sorrow. This clearly wasn't a moment he was enjoying. There was no triumph in his expression, no satisfaction at having cornered the Prime Minister. Instead, there was a deep sadness, as if he knew that by taking this unprecedented step, he had fundamentally altered the relationship between Crown and Parliament, perhaps forever. But his body language suggested he believed he had no choice, that the alternative of remaining silent would have been even worse. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was actually only about 20 minutes. Finally, Keir Starmer made a decision. His voice was measured, but you could hear the strain beneath the surface as he addressed the chamber. The Prime Minister acknowledged that the King had raised serious concerns that deserved to be addressed. He couldn't quite bring himself to agree to the independent commission exactly as the King had proposed, but he offered a compromise, a parliamentary committee with enhanced powers to investigate the matters raised, including access to all relevant government documents. King Charles listened carefully to this proposal, his expression unreadable. The chamber held its breath, waiting to see if this compromise would be sufficient to diffuse the crisis. After a long pause that felt like an eternity, the King nodded slowly. It wasn't full acceptance, and his face made clear this wasn't the outcome he had hoped for, but it was a starting point. He then issued a warning that sent chills through everyone present. If this investigation was not conducted with complete transparency and integrity, if it became merely a political exercise designed to protect those in power, he would not hesitate to intervene again. The threat was unmistakable. The King was putting Parliament on notice that he was watching, that he would continue to act if he believed the situation demanded it. This was a fundamental reshaping of the constitutional balance that had existed for centuries. The monarch was no longer content to be merely ceremonial, to offer private advice that could be safely ignored. King Charles had just demonstrated he was willing to use the moral authority and public platform of the Crown to directly challenge governmental actions he viewed as unacceptable. As the King prepared to leave the chamber, Starmer made one final attempt to reassert some control over the situation. He reminded everyone present that Britain was a democracy, that the government was accountable to Parliament and to the people through elections, not to an unelected monarch. It was a valid constitutional point, and one that would be debated extensively in the days to come. But in that moment, with the King standing before them, having just exposed what he claimed were serious governmental failings, Starmer's words felt defensive and weak. King Charles turned to face the Prime Minister one last time before departing. What he said in that moment would be quoted endlessly in the media coverage that followed. He acknowledged that yes, Britain was indeed a democracy, and that was precisely why he had felt compelled to act. Because democracy requires transparency, accountability, and leaders who genuinely serve the interests of the people rather than hiding behind the mechanisms of power. His duty as king, he stated firmly, was not to rubber stamp whatever the government decided to do, but to ensure that democratic principles were actually being upheld. With that, King Charles walked out of the chamber, leaving behind absolute chaos. MPS immediately erupted into heated debates. Some rushed to the cameras waiting outside to offer their interpretations of what had just occurred. Others huddled in groups, trying to process the constitutional implications. Social media exploded with reactions from across the political spectrum. Some hailed the King as a hero standing up for ordinary people against an overreaching government. Others condemned him as dangerously undermining democratic norms and overstepping his constitutional role. The news coverage was unprecedented in its intensity and scope. Every major broadcaster interrupted their regular programming to report on what was being called the greatest constitutional crisis in modern British history. Constitutional experts were rolled out across all channels, offering varying interpretations of what the King's actions meant for the future of the monarchy and British democracy. International media picked up the story immediately, with headlines around the world expressing shock and fascination at the dramatic confrontation in the House of Commons behind closed doors. Emergency meetings were being convened across government. Cabinet ministers gathered to discuss how to respond to this crisis, how to manage the political fallout, how to handle the investigation that was now inevitable. Some argued for a hardline approach, pushing back strongly against what they viewed as monarchical overreach. Others counselled a more conciliatory strategy, recognising that public opinion might well side with the king if the government appeared to be stonewalling legitimate concerns. The palace itself was in turmoil. Senior royal advisors who had known nothing about the king's plans were scrambling to understand what had motivated this dramatic action and what it meant for the institution of the monarchy going forward. Some were reportedly furious that Charles had acted without consulting them, understanding that he had put the crown in a potentially vulnerable position. Others quietly admitted that they had sensed the king's growing frustration with the traditional constraints of his role, but had never imagined he would take such a bold and risky step. Public reaction was deeply divided along political lines, but also cut across traditional party loyalties in unexpected ways. Opinion polls conducted in the immediate aftermath showed that a surprising number of voters, including many who had voted Labour in the last election, supported the King's intervention. They believed that he was speaking truth to power, that he was using his unique position to shine a light on governmental behaviour that needed scrutiny. These voters saw an establishment that had become too comfortable, too insulated from the concerns of ordinary people, and they welcomed someone, even an unelected monarch, who was willing to challenge that establishment. But there was also significant opposition, particularly among those who worried about the precedent being set. What would happen if future monarchs decided to intervene in political matters they disapproved of? Could Britain remain a functioning democracy if the king felt empowered to storm Parliament whenever he disagreed with government policy? These weren't trivial concerns, and they struck at the hearts of centuries of constitutional development that had carefully balanced royal authority with democratic governance. The investigation that Starmer had agreed to would become one of the most closely watched political processes in recent history. The committee formed to examine the king's allegations would face enormous pressure from all sides. Every decision they made, every document they reviewed, every witness they called would be scrutinised by a public that had been told there were serious questions to answer about how their government was operating. The committee members knew that their findings, whatever they turned out to be, would have massive implications for the future of British politics and quite possibly for the monarchy itself. The stakes could not have been higher, and everyone understood that what happened next would shape Britain's constitutional future for generations to come.